Okay, let's go from simple to advanced grammar again. Today we'll be looking at inversion once again, and this time we're looking at inversion with limiting adverbs. Now, what I call limiting adverbs are adverbs of frequency, such as hardly ever, seldom, and rarely. These are the limiting adverbs that I'm talking about. No other ones, right? So we're only concentrating on these. Now, what a simple sentence structure would look like, not a simple sentence, but a simple structure would be WHO hardly ever discovers a virus as deadly as this one. WHO is the World Health Organization. So I have a subject here, and then I have my limiting adverb, which is hardly ever. And yes, it comes directly after the subject. So I could use rarely, I could use seldom, and then I have my verb and the rest of my sentence. So all that really matters is that you know that there's a subject, there's a limiting adverb, and then there is your verb. And yes, most of these sentences would refer to the present time because they're general, but you could also use them for the past as well. So WHO hardly ever discovers a virus as deadly as this one. Now, to change it to make it more complex and a better structure, we do something like this. Hardly ever does WHO discover a virus as deadly as this one. Hardly ever does WHO discover a virus as deadly as this one. What really happened here? So I inverted. I made the inversion happen. Now, how did I do that? The WHO was up here as a subject, and then it was hardly ever. But here what I did is I brought hardly ever to the beginning of the sentence. I added does, which is my dummy auxiliary. Now it's either do, does, or did. That's it. I use does because I'm using WHO as a subject like he or she. Now, if I were using, let's say, I, then I would say hardly ever do I. But here it's hardly ever does WHO. And then the verb doesn't get S anymore because I have this does. So really the only thing that's happening is me using hardly ever. Now I could use rarely, I could use seldom, or I could use even barely. But after that, I need to have a do, or let's say a does, and sometimes in some cases you can also use a did. That is very important. And then you can start with your subject and verb. So the hardly ever comes first, do, does, or did, and then you can say the rest of your sentence. I mean, the subject and the verb, just like this. Look at the change one more time. Listen to it. WHO hardly ever discovers a virus as deadly as this one. Hardly ever does WHO discover a virus as deadly as this one. So we could use things like hardly ever, rarely, only rarely. You could use seldom, only seldom, plus your do, does, and then your subject and verb. So this is the key here. Make sure you have your do, does, or did, and then you have your subject and verb. Now, examples would look something like this. Hardly ever do I practice my lessons. Hardly ever do I do my homework. I hope that's not true, but hardly ever do I do something. It's very easy to use, especially in your speaking. When someone asks you, hardly ever do I do something. Or you could say, only rarely does she lie to her parents. Notice that I'm using does here because we're talking about she. But the one before that I'm using do because we're talking about I. Or seldom do governments give in to their people's demands. So again, here I'm using do because I'm using governments. So it's not that complicated. All you really do is you have one of these limiting adverbs, then your do, does, or did, depending on your subject, and then you have your subject and verb. It's very, very easy to do, but it's beautiful and it's complex.